In February of 1991, construction workers in Yangon, Myanmar, were digging beneath a prayer hall to extend it when their tools struck brick. Underneath the floor was a sealed, brick-lined tomb, and inside it, wrapped in the remains of a silk shroud, lay a skeleton nobody in the city could immediately identify. When officials compared the discovery against old colonial burial records, the answer stunned historians on 2 continents. The bones belonged to the last emperor of the Mughal dynasty, a man who had once ruled, at least in name, from the Red Fort in the heart of Delhi. He had been buried in secret in a foreign country, in a grave the British Empire had gone to considerable trouble to erase from memory. How does an emperor end up in an unmarked hole in the ground, roughly 1,000 miles from the throne his family had held for more than 3 centuries? And what happened to everyone he left behind, the wives, the sons, the grandchildren, the entire apparatus of a dynasty, in the century and a half after his fall? To understand that ending, you have to go back to a man named Bahadur Shah Zafar, and to an empire that was already a shadow of itself long before it was formally erased. Zafar was born in Delhi in 1775, the son of the reigning Mughal emperor, Akbar Shah II. He was not raised believing the throne was guaranteed to him. For years, the succession looked set to pass to a different prince, until that prince physically attacked a British official inside the Red Fort itself and was exiled from Delhi as punishment. That single, unrelated act of violence, not any ambition of Zafar's own, quietly cleared the path to the crown he would eventually wear almost by default. By the time he actually became emperor in 1837, Zafar was 62 years old, and the empire he inherited bore almost no resemblance to the one his ancestors had built. The Mughals had once controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, a realm of extraordinary wealth, architecture, and administration, the same dynasty responsible for the Taj Mahal. By Zafar's reign, none of that practical power remained. The East India Company, a private trading corporation that had gradually turned itself into a political and military authority, ran the actual government of India. Zafar's real jurisdiction stopped at the walls of the Red Fort and a modest stretch of land just outside Delhi. He lived on a pension paid to him by the very company that had swallowed his ancestors' empire. He held the title of emperor while functioning, in every practical sense, as a well-dressed prisoner of the company that funded him. The decline had not started with Zafar, and it had not been gentle. Decades before his reign, one of his own predecessors, Shah Alam II, had been captured, blinded, and tortured by a rival Afghan warlord who briefly seized control of Delhi. A brutal reminder of just how vulnerable the throne had already become even before the British finished consolidating power. By the time that particular crisis had passed and the East India Company had firmly established itself as the real authority across northern India, the Mughal emperors who followed had settled into something closer to ceremonial figureheads than rulers, men who signed documents, received guests, and collected a pension, while somebody else quietly ran the country in every way that actually mattered. Zafar inherited that arrangement fully formed. He did not create it, and by the time he was old enough to understand its real limits, there was no realistic path left to escape it. What he had, in place of armies and territory, was culture. Zafar's court became one of the great literary gatherings of the era, home to poets like Mirza Ghalib and Muhammad Ibrahim Zauq, men whose verses are still recited in Urdu-speaking households today. Zafar himself was a serious poet in his own right, writing under the pen name Zafar, meaning victory, an irony that would only sharpen with everything that followed. He was also a trained calligrapher and a devoted follower of Sufi mysticism. In a palace stripped of almost all real authority, poetry and faith became the one kingdom nobody could tax or annex. Delhi itself, even reduced to a single fortress and a pension, remained a magnet for scholars, musicians, and poets from across northern India. Zafar hosted regular gatherings known as musharas, evenings where the era's finest Urdu poets read new work aloud to rooms full of connoisseurs, competing for reputation rather than territory. Religious festivals, royal birthdays, and the changing seasons were all marked with ceremony inside the Red Fort, a court still performing the rituals of empire in miniature, long after the substance behind those rituals had been quietly hollowed out. To a visitor unfamiliar with the political reality, the palace could still look, for an evening at least, like the seat of genuine power. It was, in truth, a beautifully maintained illusion, propped up by a British pension and tolerated because it caused the company no real inconvenience. This was the uneasy arrangement that held for roughly 2 decades. A ceremonial emperor, a foreign corporation actually running the country in his name. A fragile peace that satisfied almost nobody, least of all the Indian soldiers serving in the company's own army, who were growing more resentful by the year over pay, land policy, and the steady erosion of Indian authority under a foreign trading house. It was never going to last, and when it finally broke in the summer of 1857, it broke in a direction Zafar never chose and, by nearly every historical account, never wanted. Even inside that fragile arrangement, the palace was not free of its own quiet power struggles. Zinat Mahal, the wife who would later follow Zafar into exile, was widely understood at court to be pushing for her own son to be recognized as heir, ahead of his older half-brothers who technically stood closer in line. It was the kind of ordinary succession maneuvering that royal households everywhere have always engaged in, almost beside the point in a palace with no real kingdom left to inherit. Nobody at court in the early months of 1857 was thinking seriously about war. They were thinking about precedence, ceremony, and which son might eventually sit, symbolically, in a chair that no longer commanded an empire. In May of that year, sepoy soldiers stationed in the garrison town of Meerut rose up in open rebellion. The immediate trigger was a rumor about the grease-coating new rifle cartridges, believed to contain both pork and beef fat, an offense to Muslim and Hindu soldiers alike, who were required to bite the cartridges open before loading. But underneath that spark sat years of accumulated grievance over taxation, land seizures, and the slow humiliation of watching a foreign company govern a subcontinent it had no historical claim to. The soldiers killed their British officers, seized what weapons and ammunition they could find, and marched toward the one place in India that still carried the weight of legitimate, ancient sovereignty: Delhi and the Red Fort inside it. On May 11th, the rebel troops reached the fort and forced their way into Zafar's private quarters. They did not ask his permission for anything. They told him what they needed from him, which was his name, his bloodline, and his blessing. The empire he had ruled only in title for 20 years was about to become the empire he was compelled to lead in fact, whether he wanted the responsibility or not. By most surviving accounts, he did not. Zafar was 82 years old, physically frail, financially dependent on the very pension the rebellion threatened to end, and well aware that an uprising of underpaid, poorly organized soldiers had little realistic chance against the military weight of the East India Company. But refusing an armed garrison camped inside his own palace was never a serious option either. He accepted the role reluctantly, becoming the symbolic emperor of a rebellion he had not planned and could barely influence once it began. His son, Mirza Mughal, was named commander of the rebel forces occupying the city. For a few chaotic months, an elderly poet who had spent 2 decades writing ghazals under British supervision found himself, on paper, the restored sovereign of a renewed Mughal India. Could not hold, and it did not. The British regrouped outside the city, brought in reinforcements from Punjab and other garrisons still loyal to the company, and laid siege to Delhi through the summer months. The fighting inside and around the walls was prolonged and brutal, dragging on for 4 months while Zafar, largely powerless over his own supposed army, watched the rebellion he had reluctantly agreed to lead slowly run out of ammunition, discipline, and options. By September, British forces had breached the city walls and were retaking Delhi street by street, in fighting that left much of the old city in ruins and thousands of its residents dead or displaced, rebel and civilian alike. Not everyone with a front-row view of the collapse left a record as intimate as Zafar's own court poets. Mirza Ghalib, the most celebrated of them, chose to remain in Delhi through the worst of the siege and its violent aftermath, and the diary and letters he wrote during those months stand today as one of the closest surviving eyewitness accounts of what the fall of the city actually looked and felt like on the ground: the fires, the executions, the empty streets where a thriving capital had stood only weeks before. The golden literary court that had defined Zafar's reign did not simply end with his exile. It ended, in real time, in the burning city its poets were forced to watch disappear around them. Watching the city he had lived in his entire life collapse under artillery fire, Zafar made the decision that would define the rest of his story. Rather than remain in the fort as it fell, he fled to Humayun's tomb, a Mughal-era mausoleum just outside the city walls, taking refuge among the graves of his own ancestors while the empire they had built finished dying in the streets around him. He did not stay hidden for long. A British officer named Major William Hodson tracked the emperor to Humayun's tomb and negotiated his surrender, personally guaranteeing Zafar his life in exchange for a peaceful capitulation. Zafar accepted the terms and walked out to face his captors. He was taken back to the Red Fort, no longer as its emperor, but as a prisoner inside the only home he had ever known. The following morning, Hodson rode back out to the same tomb for the rest of the family still sheltering there. Two of Zafar's sons, Mirza Mughal and Mirza Khizr Sultan, along with his grandson Mirza Abu Bakr, were still hiding among the mausoleum grounds. They sent word asking for the same guarantee of safety their father had received the day before. Hodson refused to promise them anything beyond unconditional surrender. Exhausted and out of options, the three princes agreed and were loaded onto an open bullock cart for the journey back into the city, under armed escort. They never made it back as prisoners. Along the road, near a gate that would afterward be known as Kuni Darwaza, the Bloody Gate, Hodson halted the cart. He ordered all three men to strip to the waist in front of a gathering crowd, reducing them publicly and deliberately from Mughal royalty to half-naked captives. Then, according to multiple contemporary accounts, he drew his own weapon and shot all three at point-blank range himself, rather than delegate the killing to his soldiers. Afterward, he stripped the bodies of their jewelry, signet rings, and ceremonial swords as personal trophies, before having the corpses taken into the city and left exposed at a police post. A final, calculated humiliation aimed at anyone still holding out sympathy for the fallen dynasty. Zafar learned what had happened to his sons and grandson while sitting as a prisoner inside the very fort that had been his family's seat of power for more than 2 centuries. He had surrendered on the strength of a promise of safety. That promise, it turned out, had only ever applied to him. What happened to his family was only part of a much larger reckoning being carried out across the city. British forces treated the recapture of Delhi as an opportunity for collective punishment, not just military victory. Thousands of residents, rebel and civilian alike, were killed in the fighting or in the reprisals that followed it. An order went out expelling nearly the entire remaining population from the walled city for months, regardless of individual involvement in the uprising. Soldiers looted freely through abandoned havelis and the palace itself, carrying off jewels, manuscripts, and decorative silver that had accumulated inside the Red Fort across 2 centuries of Mughal rule. In the years that followed, large sections of the fort's interior buildings were deliberately demolished by the British military to make room for barracks, erasing a significant portion of the physical palace along with the dynasty that had built it. The emperor's family was not the only thing being dismantled that autumn. The city itself was being taken apart, piece by piece, and rebuilt into something that no longer resembled the Delhi Zafar had grown up in. Months later, in January of 1858, the British placed Zafar on trial inside his own palace, in the Red Fort's Hall of Private Audience, the same chamber where Mughal emperors had once received foreign ambassadors as equals rather than subjects. The charges brought against him were rebellion, treason, and complicity in murder, an unusual set of accusations to level at a reigning monarch, since treason by definition requires betraying a sovereign to whom you owe allegiance. The trial's entire legal premise quietly rested on the idea that Zafar, despite the imperial title he still carried, was in practice a subject of the British crown, a devastating admission of exactly how far Mughal authority had already collapsed even before the rebellion began. The room chosen for the trial made the whole spectacle sharper. The Hall of Private Audience had been built with an inscription along its walls praising it as paradise on earth, a space designed centuries earlier so that Mughal emperors could sit above foreign visitors and receive them as supplicants. Now it was filled with British military officers, and the man sitting at the center of it, frail in his 80s, largely silent through much of the proceedings, was the one being judged. Witnesses were called. Depositions were read aloud. The formality of the process gave the appearance of a fair hearing, even though the outcome had effectively been decided the moment Zafar surrendered at Humayun's tomb. The proceedings dragged on for roughly 40 days. Zafar's own physician gave testimony against him in exchange for a personal pardon. In the end, the military commission found him guilty on every count brought against him. Under different circumstances, that verdict might easily have carried a death sentence. But Hudson's earlier guarantee of safety, made at Humayun's tomb in the chaos of the city's fall, held just enough legal and political weight to spare Zafar's life, if not his freedom, his family, or his home. Instead of execution, the court sentenced him to permanent exile, banished from the country his family had ruled in some form since the 16th century. At 4 a.m. on October 7, 1858, Bahadur Shah Zafar left Delhi for the final time. He traveled by bullock cart, accompanied by his wife Zinat Mahal and his 2 surviving sons, under armed escort bound for Rangoon, in British-controlled Burma. The emperor of a subcontinent left his own capital not in a royal procession, but in a slow-moving convoy under military guard, heading toward a port city he had never seen, in a country with which his family had no historical connection at all. Rangoon offered him no comfort and very little dignity. British authorities kept him under close, constant supervision in a modest, guarded enclosure, monitoring his visitors, restricting his movements, treating a former emperor as a political prisoner who simply happened to still be breathing. According to accounts passed down from the period, he was at times denied regular access to pen and paper, the tools of the one identity that nobody had yet managed to fully strip from him. The poet who once presided over one of the great literary courts of Asia is said, in his final years, to have scratched verses onto the walls of his own confinement using charred wood and broken brick, because there was little else left to write with. Not every member of his household made the journey with him. Some relatives and more distant family members had already scattered elsewhere during the chaos of the siege and its aftermath, left to find their own way in a Delhi that no longer had any use for Mughal titles. The small party that did travel to Rangoon, Zinat Mahal and the 2 sons who had survived the executions at the gate, effectively became the entire remaining court of an empire that had once stretched across most of a subcontinent, reduced now to a handful of people confined to a single guarded compound. He lived like this for roughly 4 years, old, stripped of empire and family and home, watching the remaining members of his household age around him in a climate none of them had ever chosen. Among the lines of poetry attributed to him from this period is a couplet mourning that he could not even find 2 yards of land for his own burial in the country he loved, a lament that would prove almost unbearably prophetic. By October of 1862, Zafar's health had collapsed. He was 87 years old, and paralysis had begun spreading through his throat, making it difficult for him to eat or speak. The British commissioner overseeing his confinement wrote at the time that the old emperor was, in his own words, sinking from illness and paralysis, with the end clearly close at hand. In preparation, guards quietly gathered lime and brick and marked out a plot of ground at the back of his enclosure. Bahadur Shah Zafar died before dawn on November 7, 1862. He was buried that same day, only hours later, in the plot his guards had already prepared. There was no procession, no public announcement, and no mourning permitted beyond his immediate family. The British deliberately left the grave unmarked, fearing that a known burial site for the last Mughal emperor could become exactly what a symbol like that always risks becoming: a rallying point, a place of pilgrimage for a population still simmering with resentment over colonial rule. Within a matter of years, the exact location of the grave had been quietly, deliberately allowed to fade from memory, precisely as intended. Back in Delhi, more than 1,000 miles away, there was already a grave waiting for him that would never be filled. Years earlier, while he still ruled from the Red Fort, Zafar had chosen his own burial plot inside Zafar Mahal, a summer palace complex in Marali, close to the shrine of a Sufi saint his family revered. That spot is still known today as the Sardgah, and it remains, right now, an empty stretch of grass. The emperor who prepared a resting place among his own ancestors died instead in a hastily dug hole on a different continent, buried by strangers acting on orders from the government that had dismantled everything he was born into. His death formally closed a chapter that had, in truth, already been closing for decades. The rebellion of 1857 had convinced the British government that leaving India's administration in the hands of a private trading company was no longer sustainable or defensible. Direct crown rule replaced company rule that very year, and within 2 decades, Queen Victoria would formally take the title Empress of India, an explicit claim to the sovereignty the Mughals had once held outright and unquestioned. The dynasty that had ruled from Delhi since the early 1500s, that had commissioned the Taj Mahal and built the Red Fort itself, ended not with a final battle or a dramatic last stand, but with an elderly poet dying quietly under guard in a foreign city, his passing barely registered in the newspapers of the empire that replaced his. Back in Rangoon, even after his death, the British were not finished trying to erase him. By 1903, protests began among Indian Muslim residents who wanted some acknowledgement of where their fallen emperor lay, even a fenced marker, even a single stone. Colonial administrators initially refused, explicitly stating it would be inappropriate for the government to construct anything resembling a tomb that might attract pilgrims. Sustained pressure and newspaper campaigns eventually forced a compromise. In 1907, nearly half a century after his death, the British agreed to install a modest stone slab bearing his name and the bare facts of his death. A second memorial stone honoring his wife, Zeenat Mahal, was added later that same year. It was a small, grudging concession, and it still fell well short of an actual honored grave. For decades afterward, even that marker's precise connection to the real burial site remained uncertain. The family Zafar left behind scattered in the aftermath of everything that had happened, stripped of the status, wealth, and protection that imperial descent had once guaranteed automatically. Some relatives received modest pensions across the following decades, first from the British administration, later from the government of independent India, from the Nizam of Hyderabad, and from a religious trust connected to a revered Delhi shrine, small, formal acknowledgments of a lineage that still carried undeniable historical weight but no remaining political power whatsoever. That thin, official pension line continued generation after generation, growing weaker each time it passed down, until it reached a man named Mirza Muhammad Badar Bakht, widely recognized as the last officially acknowledged direct male descendant of Bahadur Shah Zafar still receiving that support. He died in 1980. With him went the final institutional thread connecting the house of Timur's descendants to any formal recognition of who, exactly, they had once been. Beyond that single recognized line, the wider family disappeared into the same ordinary, unremarkable existence as everyone else around them. A newspaper survey of surviving Mughal descendants published in the mid-1980s found people working as tailors, clerks, and small tradespeople scattered across northern India, most holding on to nothing more than a handful of documents and a family story to prove a connection that carried real historical weight but no material benefit whatsoever. The name Mughal had once meant absolute sovereignty over a continent. Within a few generations, for most of the people who actually carried that bloodline, it meant almost nothing at all in practical terms, just a fact to mention quietly if it came up. For nearly a century, the actual location of Zafar's grave in Rangoon, by then renamed Yangon, remained genuinely lost, in spite of the 1907 marker, exactly as the British had originally intended. Then, in February of 1991, during construction work to extend a prayer hall on the same general site, laborers digging a drainage trench struck the brick-lined tomb by accident. Inside, they found a skeleton wrapped in the remains of a silk shroud, alongside a second grave belonging to his wife, Zeenat Mahal. More than 128 years after his death, the body of the last Mughal emperor had been found again, not through any deliberate search, but by pure chance, in the middle of unrelated repair work. The site was carefully restored, and in December of 1994, a proper mausoleum, now known as the Dargah of Bahadur Shah Zafar, was formally inaugurated over his rediscovered grave. It still stands there today, near Yangon's Shwedagon Pagoda, a modest shrine that has become exactly what the British spent enormous effort trying to prevent for more than 100 years. A place of pilgrimage and quiet remembrance. Visitors who make the trip today climb down a narrow staircase to a basement chamber to stand beside the original grave, the same brick-lined tomb the construction workers found by accident in 1991, while the floor above holds a small mosque, later memorials to his wife and a granddaughter, and photographs documenting the little that remains of his life in captivity. Indian prime ministers visiting Myanmar now routinely stop there to pay their respects. A small diplomatic ritual built entirely around a grave that colonial authorities once tried to erase from memory permanently. Back in India, the story of Zafar's descendants took a very different and considerably harder turn. In a slum on the outskirts of Kolkata, a woman named Sultana Begum has spent decades living in poverty. In a cramped two-room hut she shares with family, surviving on a modest pension. She is the widow of Mirza Muhammad Badar Bakht, the man recognized as the last direct male descendant in that formal pension line, the great-grandson, by her account and her family's long-standing claim, of Bahadur Shah Zafar himself. Her husband died in 1980, leaving her, still a young widow, to raise their family with very little support and even less recognition of exactly whose bloodline they carried. For years, Begum has pursued a legal case asking the Indian government to recognize her as an heir to the Red Fort itself, the very palace her husband's ancestor once ruled from and was later tried for treason inside, and either return some form of the property to her family or compensate her for what she describes as more than a century and a half of unlawful occupation. In 2021, a single judge on the Delhi High Court dismissed her petition, describing the decades-long delay in bringing the case as effectively inexcusable, though the court stopped short of directly ruling on whether her claimed lineage was legitimate in the first place. Her appeal to a higher bench of the same court was dismissed again in December of 2024, once more on the grounds of an unreasonable delay in filing. The case finally reached India's Supreme Court in May of 2025. A bench led by the Chief Justice of India dismissed her petition outright, describing it, in the court's own words, as completely misconceived, and pointedly asking why, if her claim justified handing over the Red Fort, it wouldn't equally justify handing over every other former Mughal property still standing across the country. A legal battle pursued for years by a woman living in genuine poverty, built on an imperial bloodline nobody seriously disputes existed, ended not with a ruling on the underlying history, but with the country's highest court declining to seriously engage with the question at all. Her story has since drawn its own attention beyond the courtroom, becoming the subject of a documentary film released the same year, a small measure of public recognition that has done little to change her circumstances. And the building at the center of her claim carries its own layer of irony, one that plays out in public every single year. The Red Fort, the palace where Bahadur Shah Zafar was born into privilege, ruled in name only, was tried for treason and ultimately lost everything, was formally inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2007 and remains one of the most recognizable symbols of independent India. Every year on August 15th, the Prime Minister of India stands on its ramparts and delivers the nation's Independence Day address from the same fortress walls where the last Mughal emperor once sat as a prisoner, awaiting judgment from the very empire that had replaced his own. The fort, originally built to project Mughal sovereignty across a continent, now exists, in its current life, to celebrate the end of the foreign rule that eventually followed the very rebellion that destroyed Zafar's world in the first place. There is a particular kind of irony sitting at the center of this entire story, and it does not resolve into anything as simple as tragedy or justice. An emperor who never wanted the crown he was eventually handed was pulled into a war he never chose to start, punished for a rebellion he tried in vain to avoid leading, and buried in secret specifically because the empire that defeated him understood exactly how powerful his memory might still become if given the chance. They were right to worry about that. The grave they hid was eventually found anyway. The shrine they tried to prevent was eventually built regardless. And the fort they stripped from him is now the stage where a different nation, born in part out of the very uprising that ended his reign, declares its own independence out loud, once a year, for the entire country to hear. In the century and a half since his death, Zafar's story has taken on a cultural weight that outlasted every institution he actually presided over. Historians have written full-length biographies of his final years and the fall of Mughal Delhi. His poetry is still taught and performed, and lines written under his pen name continue to circulate in Urdu literary circles far beyond the borders of the empire he briefly, unwillingly, tried to hold together. He is remembered today less for the throne he lost than for the way he lost it. An old poet who never wanted a war, forced to preside over the ending of a dynasty that had ruled for more than 300 years before he was even born. Fallen dynasties rarely end the way their founders imagined they would, with a final, dignified surrender or a clean line drawn under the history books. More often, as with Zafar, they end in smaller, quieter ways that keep happening long after the last emperor is gone. A grave nobody can find, a pension that runs out, a family scattered into ordinary jobs, a court case dismissed without anyone bothering to rule on whether the bloodline was even real. The crown disappears in an afternoon. The consequences of losing it stretch on for generations. Zafar himself seemed to sense, even from exile, that his story would not simply end with his own death. The line about finding no land for burial in the country he loved reads today less like a prisoner's passing complaint and more like an unervingly accurate prediction. He never received his 2 yards of ground in Delhi. That plot in Marali still sits empty today, a patch of ordinary grass marking an absence rather than a presence, waiting for a man who never made it home. What happened to India's last emperor after he lost his empire was never a single event with a clean ending. It was a slow, decades-spanning unraveling. An execution he was powerless to prevent, a trial staged inside his own throne room, a secret grave dug on foreign soil specifically to be forgotten, a family pension that thinned out generation by generation until it disappeared completely, and finally, a courtroom in the 21st century telling his own great-grandson's widow that her claim to his legacy wasn't even worth a full hearing. The empire itself ended in 1857. The real cost of that ending, for the actual people who lived through everything that followed, is still being counted quietly more than 160 years later. If you want to see what happened to another fallen dynasty after it lost everything, the next story on this channel is waiting for you.